This is our third lecture on the topic of ordinary psychosis, and I promised the last time to say a little bit about the Lacanian critique of the notion of borderline. So let's start with that. And the reason it's important, of course, is that you could say that ordinary psychosis is one response to this perceived dilemma or inadequacy. I think the best way to introduce it is to again refer to Redmond's Ordinary Psychosis in the Body. And he gives us a brief, but I think fairly incisive account of the situation. Right at the beginning, it's in the first chapter of his book, he says, in Anglo-American psychiatry, BPD emerged as a response to difficult to classify cases. As the name suggests, BPD lies on the border, or exists in between. The border refers to a clinical problem. Psychoanalysts tend to use the term for those patients who are too sick to be considered neurotic, and not sick enough to be labeled schizophrenic. Conceptually, the border also refers to the so-called midpoint between neurosis and psychosis. In terms of clinical praxis, BPD refers to a group of patients that are difficult to classify under the neurosis-psychosis distinction. So you could say, if you were being perhaps a little bit cynical or just maybe critical, that what we seem to be seeing here, certainly from a Lacanian perspective, is a dilemma of diagnosis which has itself been elevated to the dignity of a diagnostic category. Borderline now exists because there are certain cases that seem to be difficult to classify. Let's continue with the terms of what Redmond is saying and then suggest how a Lacanian approach or the notion of ordinary psychosis might try to do something a little bit differently. In terms of clinical praxis, BPD refers to a group of patients that are difficult to classify. This we've seen. Difficult to classify under the neurosis-psychosis distinction. For example, schizophrenia may be ruled out if psychotic phenomena were transitory and brief. Conversely, neurosis was to be excluded in the absence of obsessions, phobias, and conversions. Neurosis would also be ruled out if there was a presence of an impulsive, riddled, chaotic character organization. This may leave the clinician in a difficult situation. That obviously was a quote. So what we're finding here then is that we are ruling out certain phenomena. We're saying that schizophrenia is ruled out under certain circumstances, neurosis is ruled out under certain circumstances, but all that delivers us to is the possibility that there is a kind of situation at the borderline between two clinical structures. Let's go on with Redmond. Clinicians in the Lacanian field have been consistently opposed to the borderline concept, owing to the misguided diagnostic assumptions underlying this nosological group. The introduction of a midpoint between neurosis and psychosis based on the symptom severity cannot be the basis for diagnosis. In contrast, Redmond continues, the Lacanian approach to the neurosis-psychosis distinction aims to elucidate the mechanism, repression or foreclosure underlying clinical phenomena. The distinction between structure and phenomena is essential. A diagnostic impression is predicated on structure rather than symptoms. So this will take us perhaps too far afield, so we won't go very far here. But part of what Redmond wants to draw attention to is that now we have this very popular notion of borderline personality disorder. And just for the sake of it, I'm not saying that things should be ruled out, but I am saying that there's obviously some critical responses to this diagnostic category. One problem with this diagnostic category for Redmond is that now that it's easy to refer to borderline personality or BPD, that means that maybe that gets used rather than an adequate, sensitive clinical exploration of what might in fact be mild psychosis. There you go, one basic point. So mild psychosis is no longer recognized as such. That very notion seems to be somewhat sidelined because there's an easy, ready-to-hand notion of borderline personality. That's one issue. A second issue is that, and he makes this point very strongly, I'll just read the line. From a Lacanian perspective, the borderline concept is problematic on several accounts, but perhaps the most important point is that symptom severity cannot be the basis for making a diagnosis. So this is a very prevalent idea that something, when it is very severe in the field of mental disturbance, kind of seems to often point to psychosis. Like in a Lacanian world, this doesn't make sense, right? The severity of a symptom is not adequate to make a diagnosis. And particularly not if the assumption is that because something is really severe, that means it's psychosis, because then psychosis becomes a kind of stand-in concept for severe mental disturbance. We can have pretty severe disturbances at the level of a neurosis, just as we can have very mild, that's the whole idea of ordinary psychosis, very mild symptoms that are characteristic of psychosis. One needs structure here, not merely symptoms. So for Redmond, and for others, he's citing Bruce Fink here, there's at least two problems. One is one shouldn't position oneself diagnostically simply on the basis of the severity of symptoms, because severity doesn't override structure, number one. And number two, symptoms themselves are not enough to make a diagnosis. We need to be aware of structure, how the subject utilizes social relationships, language, the symbolic order, how the subject manages jouissance, and what is the nature of their transferential relations to the therapist, to the analyst. Those are much better indications. So I'll just give one more line from Redmond, and then we'll stop talking about borderline for the moment. Sounds to me that that might be another good whole lecture topic. Here's another nice quote from him. The Lacanian emphasis on structure, that is, on the subject's relationship to the other of language, and in particular on the signifier of the name of the father, which we discussed in our previous lecture, has nothing to do with symptom severity. Lacan's structural approach to diagnosis is premised on the subject's relationship to the other, and language in particular, an emphasis that is only possible when there's a clear separation between the imaginary and symbolic registers. So just to touch on that, perhaps there's a lot more to be said. There certainly is. But that's one of the reasons that Redmond is very critical of the notion of borderline personality disorder. And it's also a critique which foregrounds the importance of something like the notion of ordinary psychosis. So let's go back to Jacques-Alain Miller. And I think for me, maybe one of the standout moments in the ordinary psychosis revisited paper that we've been discussing are worth noting. One is when he gives us a little schematic depiction of what you could say is the difference between neurosis, psychosis, and now this additional element or broader conceptualization of psychosis, which is called ordinary psychosis. He is actually, I think, responding to a question at the end of his talk. And the question says, well, you've said that there's a binary clinic, but now you've also got this other thing going on, ordinary psychosis. So how would you make sense of it? Now, Jacques-Alain Miller, at the beginning of the lecture, said, well, let's have a diagram. On the one hand, it's kind of a rectangle with a line right through the middle. Here's psychosis, here's neurosis. So we've got this binary clinic. But then he suggests, well, maybe if you open up the domain of psychosis a little bit, you would have something akin to mild psychosis or concealed psychosis within the domain of psychosis. Now, the question that he is asked seems to be essentially saying, well, if you've got a binary clinic, how are you kind of smuggling a third term into a binary clinic? How does that work? So Jacques-Alain Miller is going to do an interesting thing. He's going to say, well, let's conceptualize, let me give you a little schema for each of these categories, whilst bearing in mind that we're still fundamentally dealing with a binary clinic. So he says, imagine this. In neurosis, we have the name of the father in its proper place. In psychosis, when we detect it, when we see what we'll find there is a hole instead of the name of the father working. And in ordinary psychosis, you have no functioning name of the father, but something else, a supplementary device. And he gives us this little diagram. So imagine a circle in the middle of a rectangle. This is neurosis. There's a circle in the middle of this circle, which you could say is kind of the challenge, the gap that I referred to in the preceding mini lecture when asked about a question of existence under pressurizing circumstances. What do I do when I am presented with a question of existence that's difficult to make sense of? I can draw on the name of the father, right? I got the name of the father, that's there. It gives me a speaking position that is a kind of link to social norms and understandings that locates me. I can draw on this and I can create something. I can create a life for myself. I can create a trajectory of a career of self-understandings, a way of understanding jouissance. That's our first. The second would be psychosis. In psychosis, he says, we don't have the name of the father working. Rather, there is a hole. There's something that's a gap. And as we've suggested before, presumably when there's a gap like that, there's a need to find some way of filling it or responding to the difficult questions of an existence. And maybe, to go back to something we said a little bit earlier, maybe a delusional metaphor rather than a paternal metaphor might help in that respect. So those are two. One, a little hole with the name of the father in the middle. Another, a little hole with a gap where the name of the father doesn't come to be. Now, in ordinary psychosis, says Jacques-Alain Miller, we've got a kind of, again, same size hole, and it's got a gap as well in that hole, but in the middle of it, a little circle within that circle, but a much smaller circle, we've got something that he calls the compensatory make-believe, name of the father. Something which functions as a device, something which creates an effect of stabilization that locates the person and gives them a viable kind of subjectivity where, given the foreclosure of the name of the father, there may not have been one otherwise. And of course, the idea here is that this suppletion, this compensatory make-believe name of the father, could be many different things, and it could be fairly successful. It could hold together a life for an extended period. So just to give you that little schematic, but now let's move on to what I think is maybe perhaps the most memorable part of this paper for me, when Jacques-Alain Miller wants to refer back to a crucial line in Lacan to think about how we might be better at understanding or grasping ordinary psychosis. So I'll do a little quote. It's on page 154 of this Psychoanalytic Notebooks article, Ordinary Psychosis Revisited. What are we trying to pinpoint in speaking about ordinary psychosis? That is to say, when the psychosis is not self-evident, when it doesn't look like a neurosis, it doesn't have the signature of a neurosis. It doesn't have the stability and the constancy and the repetition of a neurosis. A neurosis is something stable. It's a stable formation. When you don't feel you have the well-defined, clear-cut elements of a neurosis, he's talking to the clinician here, when you don't feel you have the well-defined, clear-cut elements of a neurosis, the regular constant repetition of the same, and you don't have the clear extraordinary phenomena of psychosis, then you're looking to say it's very possibly a psychosis, but it's not a self-evident psychosis. It's a hidden psychosis. I think that's pretty self-explanatory there. Just to make one brief note, there's this idea then that ordinary psychosis is often a concealed or not apparent or non-evident form of psychosis, which also then suggests by implication that a Schreberian psychosis, as in Schreber, Freud's literary case, is what we would call an extraordinary psychosis, one that certainly does announce itself through very noticeable manifest symptoms. What we have to do then, back to Jacques-Alain Miller, is to look for small clues. The clinic of ordinary psychosis is a very delicate clinic. Very often, it's a question of the more or less, and it directs you to what Lacan calls a disturbance that occurs at the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life. This is a great phrase. My own suspicion is that when Lacan utilizes it, and when he utilizes it in his extraordinary paper on preparing to work with psychosis, that formulation is itself somewhat indebted to Malinowski. I think there's a kind of echo of a kind of phenomenological notion there. But let's just stay with that, because I think at its best, that phrase is evocative, but it also enables us to start directing our attention, as is required in this delicate clinic, to certain facets of experience. So let's hear it again. Jacques-Alain Miller compliments Bruce Fink's translation, and again he says, this is a disturbance that occurs at the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life. Inmost juncture. So all of those terms seem important here. There's a disturbance. At the inmost juncture, it's somehow intimate, internal. At the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life. Back to Jacques-Alain Miller. Sense of life is very difficult to analyze this term. Psychiatrists have tried to delineate what the sense of life might be. They speak of synesthesia, the subject's general feeling, the general being in the world. So you hear there is a kind of little phenomenological echo of sorts going on here. back to Jacques-Alain Miller, the disturbance is in the way you feel the surrounding world, in the way you feel your own body, and in the way you relate to your own ideas. The disturbance is in the way you feel the surrounding world, in the way you relate to your own body, and the way you relate to your own ideas. So that threefold disturbance then, a relationship to the world, to social reality, we could say, a relationship to one's own embodied state, and in the way one relates to your own ideas. He continues, but what kind of disturbance? Because surely neurotics too feel a profound disturbance in their existence. A hysterical subject feels disturbance in her relationship to her body. An obsessional subject feels a disturbance in relationship to his ideas. So what is this disturbance that occurs at the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life? So already in that quote, we've got a little minimal differential diagnostic thing happening. If one is now sensitized to looking out for listening for this inmost juncture, disturbance at the inmost juncture of the subject's sense of life, we know that some form of disturbance, this is Lacanian psychoanalysis after all, is part and parcel of what it means to be human. Everybody's going to have some of that disturbance. But do those disturbances occur and cause conflicts and cause problems at the level of one's bodily sensibilities? Is it a case, to go back to the quote, where the hysterical subject feels a disturbance in her relationship to her body, or his relationship to his body, if it's a male hysteric? Or is it a case where they seem to be localized, as it presumably is, for the obsessional subject, where there's a disturbance in relationship to their ideas? Already then, if it's kind of localized in one of those areas, and it takes on the form of a conflict where there's questions that breed more questions and also come up with answers, and there's some kind of dialectical movement between the asking of a question and a possible answer, that sounds a lot more neurotic. When it is not subject to a dialectical movement, when it's subject to a certain kind of fixity and immovability, you might say, then it sounds like it's a lot more in the domain of psychosis. So we'll stop there, but what we'll do in the follow-up, fourth video, is to ask about what are this threefold externality? What are these three modes of externality, and how can we speak a little bit about them? Social externality, bodily externality, and subjective externality.